Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's CIW seminar. My name is Ben Hillman and I'm the Director of the Australian Centre on China and the World at ANU. And it's our great pleasure tonight to welcome a guest speaker from the United States, from Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, Professor Zhichun Zhu. And he is going to be talking to us about the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and its implications for the region. I'd like to, before we begin our talk tonight, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Professor Zhu will be speaking for about 45 minutes. Following that, we can have question and answer. For those of you, as a larger number joining us online, welcome. Please send your questions through the chat box. You can send them at any time during the seminar or after, and I will curate those online questions and present them to Professor Zhu. When you do send your question, please be very helpful and relevant for Professor Zhu, if you could tell us your name and your affiliation when you send the questions. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. I'm sure you will enjoy the talk. I'm looking forward to it very much. And over to you, Professor Zhu.
Thank you, Professor Hillman. It's really a great honor and pleasure to visit the ANU and speak at the Australian Centre on China in the World. I want to thank the audience in the room as well as online for participating in this important discussion. I guess your participation shows your interest in this topic. So the topic, of course, is the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and its implications. So I will keep my brief remarks under maybe 40 minutes or so. So I make 3 points and leave plenty of time for discussions. First, what is the Indo-Pacific strategy? Second, how is the Biden administration implementing the Indo-Pacific strategy? And finally, what it means and how regional countries have responded to the strategy. First, what is the Indo-Pacific strategy? I think we all know that the United States is a global power, but of course, it's also an Asia power. However, the United States for a long time used to be Eurocentric in terms of history, culture, and foreign policy. President Barack Obama called himself America's first Pacific president and started to pivot U.S. foreign policy towards Asia, a process that President George W. Bush would have started if 9/11 did not happen. Obama was right, because the United States has been a Pacific power dating back to the mid-19th century when American commercial interests expanded across the Pacific to Asia. Of course, today we barely use the term Asia-Pacific anymore, right? Actually, Donald Trump helped popularize the term Indo-Pacific during his first Asia trip as the US president in November 2017. Since then, officials, diplomats, scholars, and journalists around the world have switched their label for that region from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. By the way, based on my research, I think the Indo-Pacific as a geopolitical concept first appeared in European publications in the 1920s. Anyway, the Trump administration officials began to promote the concept Indo-Pacific in 2017. I think it was then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson who first mentioned or used the term free and open Indo-Pacific in his speech at CSIS in Washington, D.C. on October 18th, 2017. The Trump administration's Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework of 2018 aimed to maintain diplomatic, economic, and military preeminence in the fastest growing region of the world. Obama emphasized America first and went it alone, or without working with allies. Now, with Biden in the White House, I think the Biden administration has largely inherited the Trump administration's Asia policy, although he's taking a recalibrated approach. The Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy was unveiled in February 2022. It has 5 objectives. They are: advance a free and open Indo-Pacific, build connections within and beyond the region, drive regional prosperity, foster Indo-Pacific security, and build regional resilience to transnational threats. To explain the US shift of focus to Asia, the Indo-Pacific Strategy document says, I quote, "This intensifying American focus is due in part to the fact that the Indo-Pacific faces mounting challenges, particularly from the PRC. The PRC is combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological might as it pursues a sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and seeks to become the world's most influential power. The PRC's coercion and aggression spans the globe, but it is most acute in the Indo-Pacific," unquote. So the document also says, our objective is not to change the PRC system, but to shape the strategic environment in which it operates, building a balance of influence in the world that is maximally favorable to the United States, our allies and partners, and interests and values we share. And it says, we, the United States, will cooperate with our allies and partners while seeking to work with the PRC in areas like climate change and non-proliferation. Now, please pay attention to the nuances here, all right? I think in the past, when the United States said, we would like to work with allies and partners in dealing with issues such as North Korea and non-proliferation, actually China was considered as a partner, right? But now, apparently, China is just a pure competitor, not a partner anymore, even on climate change and the North Korean issue. To complement the security dimension of the Indo-Pacific strategy, President Biden launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, on May 23rd, 2022. The framework included 13 original member nations, with the late entry of Fiji as the 14th member. And Australia, of course, is an original member of the IPEF, right? And IPEF represents 40% of the global GDP, but it does not include China. The proposed IPEF includes 4 themes: fair and resilient trade, supply chain resilience, infrastructure, clean energy and decarbonization, tax and anti-corruption. Biden described the initiative as, quote, writing the new rules of the 21st century economy, unquote. So the IPEF competes with other regional economic cooperation frameworks, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and the CPTPP. The IPEF apparently outweighs RCEP in both population and GDP. The only RCEP members not included in the IPEF are China, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, while non-RCEP members in the IPEF are the United States, India, and Fiji. Of course, the you know RCEP, right? It was signed in November 2020. It was the first free trade agreement among the largest economies in Asia, including all 10 ASEAN nations, plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So basically it's ASEAN plus 5. The 15 member countries account for about 30% of the world's population and 30% of global GDP. Now, another competitor is CPTPP, of course, right? It was signed in Santiago, Chile in March 2018 by 11 countries. These 11 members are along the Pacific coast, of course, including Australia also, right? But the United States withdrew from the original TPP under President Trump, so it's not a member yet. As of now, I think the United Kingdom, China, and Taiwan have submitted their formal applications to join CPTPP. South Korea has expressed interest. The United States has not. It should be pointed out, the United States and China are not in these competing economic groups together, which raises the questions or concerns about inclusiveness or the true intentions of those groups, right? I think the only trade bloc that both the United States and China are members of is the APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which was formed in 1989 with 21 members. Right? It is also interesting to note that the United States did not include Taiwan in Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But shortly after the launching of the IPEF, the United States-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade was unveiled. According to some analysis, the United States did not include Taiwan in the IPEF for fear of losing several Southeast Asian members, such as Indonesia, who do not want to offend China. So that's a very brief overview of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. Clearly, it has both security and economic dimensions. And competing with China is undoubtedly a key objective, right? So let me quickly move to the second point. How is the Biden administration implementing the Indo-Pacific strategy? I think we can use the numbers 1 through 5, what I call the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scheme, to understand how the Biden administration has been advancing the Indo-Pacific strategy. Despite the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration has continued to focus on China as the most consequential strategic challenger. Russia, by comparison, is considered as acute yet short-term threat. The Biden administration seems confident that it can walk and chew gum at the same time, namely countering Russia and China simultaneously in 2 theaters. In the Indo-Pacific, great power politics revolves around growing US-China rivalry. The number 1 refers to the fact that the United States is the only superpower now after the Cold War. And it wants to maintain that global dominance, including in the Indo-Pacific region. From the US perspective, only one superpower can exist. The United States will not tolerate the rise of a peer rival. And today, China has been identified as the near peer competitor. The United States will do anything and everything possible to stop any challenger from overtaking its dominant position in the world. The rise of China as a major heterogeneous civilization of power is especially challenging, which is different from the mere transfer of power between states from the same civilization or share the same values. And I think here lies the structural conflict. China is trying to realize the so-called Chinese dream or China dream to restore its historical glory and to become the dominant power of Asia again. And the United States is determined to push back China's challenge to its global and regional dominance. So the intensive rivalry will shape the political economy and security of the Indo-Pacific region for a long time to come. That's number one. The number two refers to the bilateral alliances the United States has maintained in the region since World War II. This is the so-called hub and spokes structure, in which the United States is the hub, with bilateral alliances reaching out as the spokes, forming a strong security alliance network. As you know, the United States has 5 former allies in the Indo-Pacific: Australia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand. In addition, the United States maintains strong partnerships with several other countries, such as Singapore, Indonesia, and India. And of course, New Zealand is also a major non-NATO ally. Obviously, through bilateral alliances and partnerships, the United States has deepened its involvement in the Indo-Pacific in response to China's rise. Notably, Washington has been boosting India's statures in America's Asia policy in recent years, which leads to well, just in a minute. Next, I'm going to talk about number 3, but number 4 is going to be Quad, right, which will include India, right? So the number 3 refers to the trilateral security group called AUKUS. Very familiar to this group. It's a new group comprising Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States, which was formed in September 2021. As you know, Australia and France had a diesel submarine deal, but the United States and the United Kingdom decided that they will provide nuclear submarines to Australia. And when AUKUS was announced without notice, France immediately recalled its ambassadors to both Washington and Canberra in protest. And the French foreign minister called AUKUS pact a stab in the back. I understand the new Labour government here has agreed to pay the French shipbuilder naval group as certain amount of money as compensation, right, to reset the relationship with France. So the two countries seem to have buried the hatchet. And of course, the AUKUS raised concerns in the region, including inside Australia, to my understanding. For example, peace and environmental groups here oppose the potential introduction of nuclear weapons into Australia. And of course, the Chinese government responded by stating that these will seriously disrupt the regional peace and stability, intensify the arms race, and undermine international non-proliferation efforts. I'm sure policymakers in Washington, Canberra, and London will probably not consider this as a case of nuclear proliferation, but I think it will certainly complicate efforts to denuclearize Iran and North Korea. Now, number 4 refers to the Quad, or the quadrilateral security dialogue among the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, which is viewed as the Asian version of NATO by some observers. The new South Korean administration of President Yoon actually has expressed interest in joining the Quad, but the United States has no plan to expand Quad now. The idea of Quad was initiated by then Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007 and formalized in 2017 during the ASEAN summit in Manila that year. All 4 members, led by Abe, Australian Prime Minister Turnbull, Indian Prime Minister Modi, and US President Trump, agreed to formalize this 4-party dialogue in order to counter China militarily and diplomatically, especially in the South China Sea. Soon after the Russian-Ukraine war broke out, Quad leaders met on March the 3rd to discuss the impact of the crisis on Indo-Pacific, especially on Taiwan. The United States, Australia, and Japan also called on India to join them in condemning and sanctioning Russia. And of course, India has rejected due to its critical military and economic ties with Russia. We all know that India has been a leader in the non-aligned movement since the early 1950s. So by becoming a member of the Quad, I would argue that India actually has arguably violated its long-standing principle. Now, the number five refers to the Five Eyes intelligence sharing community, as well as the brand new partners in the Blue Pacific to respond to China's expansion in the South Pacific. Five Eyes, of course, is an Anglosphere group of English-speaking nations comprising Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, United States as well, which cooperate on intelligence cooperation and sharing. Can be traced back to World War II, when the United States and the United Kingdom shared intelligence. As the Cold War deepened, the intelligence sharing community arrangement became formalized under the echelon surveillance system in the 1960s. I think among the five members, New Zealand seems to be the least active in terms of publicly confronting China. A recent security arrangement between China and the Solomon Islands has alarmed Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. In response to China's expansion into the South Pacific, the partners in the Blue Pacific was recently launched by the United States, Japan, Australia, Britain, and New Zealand, as the five countries pursue more effective and efficient way to deal with challenges from China. So this is the brand new group of five. So the number five refers to two things, right? Five Eyes and the partners in the Blue Pacific. Now, these five things, one superpower, bilateral alliances, AUKUS, the Quad, the Five Eyes, and partners in the Blue Pacific, capture how the United States is working with its close allies and partners to implement the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the main objective of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy is to defend the rules-based international order and to counter China's expanding influence. Will the United States change or dilute the Indo-Pacific strategy after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Will the center of the global power politics move back to Europe from Asia? I think the short answer is no, right? Just look at the US Department of Defense 2022 National Defense Strategy, which was published on March 28th, more than a month after the Russian-Ukraine war. In the document, the United States said, we will continue to identify China as the major challenge. This is despite ongoing Russian and Ukraine war. And Secretary of State Blinken outlined the Biden administration's broad foreign policy agenda in two separate speeches. He made a first speech in March 2021. He said, I quote, "Our relationship with China will be competitive where it should be, collaborative where it can be, and adversarial when it must be." In his China speech, most recently, May 2022, Secretary of State Blinken said, I quote, "We will invest domestically, align with our allies, and compete with China." The three keywords, right? Invest, align, and compete. So the ultimate objective is still competition with China and win the competition. So this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scheme summarizes what the Biden administration has been doing to advance the Indo-Pacific strategy, working with allies and partners. Now that leads to my third point. What this strategy means for the region and how have regional countries responded so far, right? It's still ongoing, of course, right? And not every country has clearly expressed their reactions to this, but this is just based on reading the news and public announcements, official documents, so we can tell how regional countries have responded to this strategy so far. As Japan's Nikkei Asia stated in an editorial, a free and open Indo-Pacific is a euphemism for containing China in the region. Now, whether we agree with that assessment is open to discussion, but I think the Indo-Pacific strategy has raised a lot of questions and put some countries in the region in an uncomfortable position between a rock and a hard place. And I think that if we truly want to have a free and open Indo-Pacific, shouldn't we include China in it instead of forming all these groups to combat China, right? The essence of the Indo-Pacific strategy is US-China competition. There's no doubt about it. And most Asian countries would prefer not having to choose between the two big powers. And of course, the Chinese government has criticized this, no doubt about it, right? Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi criticized the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as an attempt to further economic decoupling from China. Wang Yi argued that the initiative and the US Indo-Pacific strategy as a whole created divisions and incited confrontation. Those are his words, not my words, okay? And Foreign Minister Wang also stated that such an agreement would ultimately be a failure. Most countries prefer to maintain good relations with both the United States and China. Singapore has been pretty vocal in making this position known. For example, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has repeatedly said, don't force us to choose sides, between the two powers. Former Prime Minister of Singapore, Goh Chok Tong, also said, I quote, the United States has outlined its fight with China as one of democracies versus autocracies. It would have been better had the United States defined the fight as good governance versus bad governance, unquote. And of course, he also said, the end result is that the United States relationship with China will end up as a negative-sum game, not even a zero-sum game. In a recent Shangri-La dialogue held in Singapore, delegates from small countries, including Singapore and Fiji, also warned against framing the Ukraine crisis as part of an ideological contest between democracies and autocracies. Very interesting, right? And of course, Fiji's defense minister said during the Shangri-La dialogue that the biggest security threat in the Asia-Pacific region is climate change, not anything else. So obviously, not everybody, look at the situation and frame the competition between China and the United States the same way, right? Overall, countries in the region are concerned about the prospect of a US-China conflict and prefer to approach China cautiously. Indonesia's defense minister, Subianto, said at Shangri-La dialogue, I quote, China has been a great civilization. They've been leaders of Asia for many thousands of years. We urge everybody to respect the rightful rise of China, unquote. Malaysia's former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad also criticized the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as an initiative intended to isolate China, saying, I quote, "Many countries recognize that this is not an economic grouping, but it's truly a political grouping," unquote. Now, India, of course, is an interesting case, right? I mentioned India being a member, a leader in a non-aligned movement. And of course, India is also ambitious to become a major power today. It is already a major power in the region, right? It's a member of the Quad, but it's also a member of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where both Russia and China are members or even leaders, right? Depending on how you look at it. So India apparently tries to maintain good relations with all major powers, right? Not trying to offend anybody. And of course, among Quad members, India is the least active. India did not join the RCEP, this regional comprehensive economic partnership in Asia, right? Many Indians criticized Prime Minister Modi for losing such a great opportunity for India to be integrated into the global economy. So this time around, India joined the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, perhaps unsurprisingly, right? India's External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said, "India is not sitting on the fence, it's sitting on the ground." I think that's really captures India's skillful diplomacy. Japan, of course, is perhaps most cooperative with Washington in countering China. It has been a strong advocate of Quad. Also, Japan has been more proactive recently on the Taiwan issue. And it is considering dispatching civilian defense officials to be posted in Taiwan to strengthen defense cooperation with Taiwan. Of course, this is a new development, right? And also Japanese officials, including Prime Minister Kishida, have made these analogies between Ukraine and Taiwan and have suggested that Europe and Indo-Pacific security are inseparable. And of course, the critics say that Japan's foreign policy is mostly made in Washington, not Tokyo. Kind of harsh, right? But I think, to some extent, probably it's true, right? Now, Australia, I mean, this audience know much better than me about Australia's foreign policy or how Australia has or should respond to the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think by default, Australia will definitely stand firmly with the United States because of our shared values and interests in the region. But my question is, other than that, what else can Australia do as the United States-China competition intensifies? And of course, we need also to improve Australia-China relations. I think there have been some positive signs recently, right? And defense ministers from the two countries have met in Singapore, resuming the high-level dialogue that was suspended a couple of years ago. I think Foreign Minister Penny Wong is going to meet with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi either today or tomorrow. If they have not met yet, maybe they have already met. And I'm checking the news before this. Apparently it has been not reported yet. But I think they're going to meet today or tomorrow, as both of them are attending the G20 Foreign Ministers Summit in Bali, Indonesia now. And of course, Prime Minister Albanese sent a letter of appreciation to Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, who congratulated him on his election victory. And Chinese Ambassador Xiao Chen made a conciliatory speech recently at the University's Technology Sydney. I'm sure you heard about that speech, which was disrupted by rounds of protests, right? But in that speech, Chinese Ambassador Xiao Chen explicitly said there are no preconditions for improving relations between Australia and China. And he denied the existence of the so-called 14 points, which I think is very interesting, which is also a good sign that Beijing is ready to start anew with the new government here. So finally, let me quickly sum up what my key points. Almost 40 minutes now, right? Can the United States achieve its Indo-Pacific objective without including China in the strategy? I mean, the question sounds like an oxymoron, right? Because if you want to have a free and open Indo-Pacific, you may have to work with China, because China is a major power over there. If you don't include China over there, how can you have a free and open Indo-Pacific over there, right? In other words, I think, I would argue that the Indo-Pacific strategy will have to be inclusive instead of focusing on countering China. Now, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and other US officials have all said that we are not seeking confrontation with China and not seeking a new Cold War with China. But from Beijing's perspective, the United States is exactly seeking confrontation with China by, for example, selling advanced weapons to Taiwan and upgrading political economic relations with Taiwan. And it is exactly seeking a new Cold War by forming all these exclusive small political security groups to contain China. Right? Now that's China's perspective, right? I think although China is a peer competitor, the United States still needs to work with China in order to make progress on issues where there are, in fact, common interests, especially on climate change and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I think the challenge for current and future administrations in Washington when dealing with China is finding the right mix of cooperation and competition. We also need to understand that not all countries look at China or even Russia through the same lens. Many countries are engaged in hedging strategies where they seek to balance relations with the United States and China and with Russia and the United States because of the benefits that derive from maintaining strong and robust relations with the United States and all these other major powers. And of course, India is a good example. And all these other small countries in Southeast Asia, especially Singapore, have clearly demonstrated those kind of hedging strategy. A free, open, prosperous, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region serves the long-term interests of all countries in the region. But if this concept turns out to be divisive for Asia, it will destabilize the region and add fuel to the fire in the already tense US-China competition. I think healthy competition is good because, as they say, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? But a zero-sum type of competition will only aggregate tensions between China and the United States and divide the region instead of unifying the region. And with that comment, I will stop here, and I look forward to Q&A and discussions. Thank you very much for your patience.